and welcome everyone to the next installment of EMS Focus, a collaborative federal webinar series. My name is Noah Smith, and I'm an EMS specialist with the Office of Emergency Medical Services at NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Together with our federal partners, NHTSA's Office of EMS is focused on advancing a national vision for emergency medical services. The projects we undertake and the resulting resources for the community help by planning for system improvements, measuring the health of EMS systems nationwide, and delivering the data that EMS leaders need to advance their individual systems. Another role of the Office of EMS is to educate the community on new innovations, processes, and technologies that can, in the end, help provide better and more efficient patient care. This free webinar series, hosted by NHTSA, will provide the EMS community with a unique opportunity for federal EMS agencies to share information with the community in a manner that is more personal and less time-consuming than attending conferences, yet offers the community the opportunity to interact and ask questions more so than a newsletter or an article would allow for. EMS Focus conducts webinars every other month on issues that are important to the EMS community and provides you with timely information on what federal agencies are doing about those issues. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be archived at www.ems.gov for future viewing and listening. More information on the EMS Focus webinar series can be found on ems.gov. Next slide. Thank you. Today, a number of us from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration will share information about DOT's ongoing efforts to investigate and analyze more than 20 years of ground ambulance crash data, and to help keep EMS practitioners across the nation safe as they take to the roadways to support the needs of their communities. I've been with the NHTSA Office of EMS for about 5 years, where I mainly focus on federal interagency coordination, administering the National EMS Advisory Council, and projects on EMS performance measurement and reimbursement policy. I've also been an EMT for 10 years and continue to volunteer for a local fire department right outside of Washington. Today, however, we're going to talk about another passion of mine, safety, in particular the safety of those in and around ambulances. We recognize that there are conflicting statistics often cited on ambulance crashes in the United States, and we continue to conduct outreach efforts about current federal programs which provide you with comprehensive data from the last 20 years from the source for traffic safety data, NHTSA. This is important so that future conversations about ambulance safety can begin with accurate baseline information. And much of that information is actually already on our website, ems.gov. Just click on Issues and then Safety. The objectives of today's presentation are to describe the scope and impact of ground ambulance crashes in the United States over the last 20 years, understand how NHTSA investigates and reports on ground ambulance crashes, understand the biggest contributors to serious injury and fatalities of ambulance occupants in crashes, and to recognize the importance of proper use of safety restraints for both providers and patients. Today's speakers include myself, Marinda Gormley from the Office of Emergency Medical Services, Peter Kivett from the Office of Defects Investigations, and Harold Herrera from the Division of Crash Investigations, all at NHTSA. And I'll introduce each one of them as they get ready to present. Quickly, some background information about NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration at the U.S. Department of Transportation. There are many different offices at NHTSA who are involved in analyzing, investigating, documenting, and creating national reports on ground ambulance crashes. And we work closely with many of those offices almost daily. But you don't often hear from them, and that's why this is such a special opportunity. Broadly, we have two areas of focus at NHTSA, which you can see in green and in red on the org chart in front of you. What we call the vehicle side of the house is in red, and that's the side that regulates the safety aspects of the auto industry. They crash test cars and vehicles, and they collect and they analyze national data on vehicle crashes, on potential defects, and that includes investigating particular crashes, which we're going to be talking about later today. The behavioral side of the house, which is also called traffic injury control, is in green, and they're the ones who perform research and deliver programs that influence people's driving and other behaviors. This could be seatbelt programs, motorcycle helmet programs, impaired driving programs, and also emergency medical services programs. And you'll see in yellow the 4 programs at NHTSA that we're going to be talking about today. Here at NHTSA and in the Office of EMS, we support a systems approach to emergency medical services. Our mission is to reduce death and disability by providing leadership and coordination to the EMS community in assessing, planning, developing, and promoting comprehensive, evidence-based emergency medical services and 911 systems. And we've been doing so since the late 1960s. In fact, our very first NHTSA administrator was a physician named Bill Haddon, and he recognized the critical role that EMS plays in saving lives after a traffic crash. But he also recognized that an EMS system must be prepared to respond to all types of emergencies, not just those on our roadways. Our national priorities, which you can see listed on the slide in front of you, are only accomplished through partnerships and collaboration. And today's presentation and the work we're doing on ambulance safety is a really great example of NHTSA working across the agency on a single safety goal, but also working across the federal government and with many national organizations and state and local stakeholders to achieve that goal. NHTSA is doing a lot to keep you and your patients safer in the back of ambulances. In today's presentation, we will broadly discuss how we document and analyze data from 20 years of crashes involving ambulances that resulted in a fatality. Then, how our teams investigate and address potential defects in ambulances, and how we perform on-the-ground investigations of serious ambulance crashes. Finally, we'll discuss our analysis of those crash investigations and end with lessons to keep you and your patients safer in ambulances. And like we said, we'll be taking questions at the end of the presentation. I'll now introduce Miranda Gormley, a public health fellow in the NHTSA Office of EMS, to provide an overview of ambulance crash data from the last 20 years. Miranda has been with NHTSA for nearly 3 years and recently became a nationally certified paramedic. So take it away, Miranda.
Thank you, Noah. As Noah said, my name is Miranda Gormley, and I've been a public health fellow in the Office of EMS for almost 3 years. During the 8 years I've been an EMT, I've also worked in EMS systems in 3 different states, and I currently serve as a volunteer EMT in Fairfax County, Virginia. I've been privileged to work with a variety of EMTs, and after about 3 years of running calls with a lot of different people, I've come to look at those who ride with me as less like coworkers and more like my family. Keeping my EMS family safe is very important to me, and I hope that the information that we present about these crashes can enable others to keep their EMS family safe as well. Next slide. We'll start by looking at an overview of ground ambulance crashes in the United States between 1992 and 2011. Over the past 20 years, there was an estimated annual average of 4,500 traffic crashes involving a ground ambulance. More than half of these crashes result in property damage only. A little more than a quarter result in an injury or injuries to persons involved in the crash, and less than 1% result in a fatality or fatalities of those involved in the crash. It's important to note that crashes involving injuries or fatalities include all of the people who are involved in the crash. This includes occupants of the ambulance, occupants of other vehicles involved, and non-occupants, such as a pedestrian or a bicyclist that may have been involved in the crash. This graph shows the 20-year overview of ambulance crashes. Each bar represents the average number of crashes over a 5-year time period. As you can see by the dominance of blue, property damage crashes make up the largest proportion, followed by injury crashes in green, and the slivers of red at the bottom represent fatal crashes, which is, again, less than 1% of total crashes. Overall, our estimated annual average of 4,500 crashes amounts to an average of 12 ambulance crashes per day. You can see by this graph that the total number of crashes remains fairly consistent over time, with no large increase or decrease in the overall incidence of crashes. At NHTSA, we use data collected from these crashes to try to reduce all types of crashes, and the Office of EMS is focusing specially on what we can do to make those bars representing the serious and fatal injuries as small as possible. To understand what can be done, we have to understand the scope of the issue. So in the following slides, we will focus on what is happening in less than 1% of these crashes, the fatal crashes, and we'll discuss what NHTSA is doing to make those slivers of red even harder to see. This graph shows fatal crashes involving an ambulance from 1992 to 2011. Over the past 20 years, there was an annual average of 29 fatal ambulance crashes and an annual average of 33 fatalities that resulted from those crashes. To put this in perspective, that means on average there were less than 3 fatal ambulance crashes per month, and on average less than 3 fatalities per month that resulted from an ambulance crash. In order to prevent fatalities, we need to know who is sustaining a fatal injury and where they are at the time of the crash. To do this, we focus on 4 types of people located inside and outside of the ambulance. Inside of the ambulance, we have 2 types of people, the ambulance driver and the ambulance passenger, any occupant that is not driving the ambulance. Outside of the ambulance, there are also 2 types of people, all occupants of other vehicles involved in the crash, and any non-vehicle occupant involved in the crash, such as a pedestrian or a bicyclist. This pie chart shows the proportion of each type of person that sustains a fatal injury during an ambulance crash. Here we can see that 3/4 of these fatalities occur outside of the ambulance, primarily to occupants of the other vehicle involved in the crash. Of the 1/4 of fatalities that occur inside of the ambulance passengers make up a larger proportion than do the ambulance drivers. Here we can see that of the annual average 33 fatalities, the largest proportion are sustained by people outside of the ambulance, and that leaves us with an average of less than 9 fatalities occurring inside an ambulance per year. Now that we understand who is involved in these crashes, let's focus on the conditions where these crashes are occurring. Understanding the location and conditions at the time of these crashes is very important when you consider driver training. Knowing that nearly half of these crashes occur at an intersection drives home the importance of clearing an intersection before proceeding through, which many drivers learn during an emergency vehicle operation course. As a volunteer EMT and a nearly released ambulance driver, I think anyone who drives an ambulance would likely agree with me that during bad weather conditions, we become more vigilant as a driver. We slow down, and we may even be more likely to tell everybody in our crew to buckle up. Looking here at the conditions at the time of the fatal ambulance crash, we see these crashes aren't occurring on days when roads are snowy or wet. They are occurring during peak traffic hours on clear, sunny days. This highlights the need for us to be vigilant and ensure everyone is buckled up every time we operate an emergency vehicle, regardless of the time or the weather. At NHTSA, we also analyze data on what happens to the vehicle during a fatal crash. While characteristics of the damage sustained to the vehicle itself may not seem important to us as providers, this information is vital to creating a safer vehicle. By knowing the most common crash mechanisms and location of damage to the ambulance, our partners at the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health have been able to develop ambulance crash testing standards that enable manufacturers to build safer ambulances. Now that we've discussed the characteristics associated with fatal ambulance crashes, I will turn the discussion back to Noah.
Thank you so much, Miranda. I'd now like to introduce Peter Kivett, who is an engineer with the Office of Defect Investigations at NHTSA. Peter has over 15 years of experience at NHTSA and currently specializes in heavy trucks and emergency response vehicles. Peter's going to provide an overview of the Office of Defects Investigations here and how you can spot and report a possible defect here to us at NHTSA. Peter.
Thank you, Noah. The Office of Defects Investigations is a regulatory office that influences the manufacturers in performing automotive safety recalls. We are the people that you call when you have a problem with your ambulance that you believe may have a safety-related defect. Regardless if the ambulance is traveling on the road or at the scene, if the mission of the ambulance is compromised, and if the data supports your claim, then we, Office of Defects Investigations, will investigate the issue and possibly open an investigation. Most failure mechanisms for the ambulance fall within our regulatory office. So please, if you believe you have an automotive-related defect, give us a call or look us up online. You can find us at safercar.gov, or you can actually go to NHTSA.gov and filter your way down to find a complaint or file a complaint. ODI's mission is broken down into 3 specific points. ODI identifies defects related to motor vehicle safety through trend analysis. Manufacturers, quarter reports, and early warning submissions, media, and public outreach. You can file a complaint, again, through safercar.gov. That's where most of our investigations get started from. ODI assures safety defects are remedied properly and effectively by making manufacturers submit quarterly updated reports, completed report rates, and percentages. The goal is to get all effective defects recalls to 100% completion. And lastly, ODI assures information related to the defect investigation and safety recalls are readily available to the public through our website, safercar.gov. You can log on to NHTSA, again, and navigate your way through safety recalls to find this information. ODI's is a data-driven identity that relies on your field complaints to better serve you. While we have no current ambulance investigations, we are endlessly monitoring and talking to ambulance services, constantly staying vigilant, and searching for defects. Next. So what constitutes a safety defect? Many people are not clear on how the process of a recall works or what is a defect. NHTSA defines an automotive defect as a flaw in a motor vehicle or motor vehicle equipment presenting an unreasonable risk of accident, death, or injury. Upon acknowledgement that a safety defect exists from the manufacturer, whether influenced by ODI or not, the manufacturer must submit to ODI the safety defect that a safety defect exists, followed up by internal paperwork. It is the manufacturer's responsibility to determine the corrective action and the proper influenced population. ODI believes, and moreover, all emergency response vehicles fall within the same threshold as an ambulance or over your normal commuter vehicle. ODI believes that an ambulance, as well as other emergency response vehicles, parallels school buses. So that basically means that all ambulance, EMS vehicles, and school buses fall within a different threshold. If a dome light fails to exist, if a dome light fails to not work in your commuter vehicle, ODI doesn't necessarily believe that this is a safety-related defect. However, if the patient cab area in an ambulance loses lighting or all 12-volt accessories, ODI considers this a safety defect. ODI believes the mission of the ambulance is compromised. Below, you will see defect examples. These examples are ambulance affected by recalls between the years 2001 and 2014. Since 2001, a little over 5,000 ambulances from 6 different ambulance manufacturers have been subjected to safety recalls.
Thank you so much, Peter. And just to underscore what Peter's talking about with the Office of Defects Investigations, which is such a cool and unique office in the government, that particularly about ambulances, that anything related to the mission of the ambulance, anything that you need to take care of your patient is important, that may not be working properly, is important to report to us. So when we're talking about defects related to ambulances, we're not just talking about tires. We're talking about lights and heating systems and things that we need to properly take care of our patients. And we need your help, right? We need to hear from folks on the ground who are managing fleets of ambulances, who are working on the ground every day, who are recognizing problems that, you know, they might write down on a sheet and just hope that the next crew will take care of. But if you're recognizing an issue, there's a strong likelihood that someone else is as well. And so just as Peter said, head to safercar.gov, give us a call on the hotline, and we would love to hear from you and explore that problem and whether there's a possible defect or not. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Noah.
And now I'll introduce Harold Herrera, who's the team leader for Special Crash Investigations at NHTSA. This is really one of the most interesting and important programs we have at NHTSA. Harold's team is on the ground investigating crashes of all kinds across the country. But for over a decade, they've been investigating ambulance crashes that result in a fatality or a serious injury inside the ambulance. Harold, who has over 27 years of experience as a crash investigator and a reconstructionist, will provide an overview of the investigative process, and then Miranda will come back to describe how we analyzed that information and provide what we found. So I'll turn it over to Harold.
Thank you, Noah. Since 1972, the Special Crash Investigation Program has provided NHTSA with in-depth crash investigation data. Data collected by SCI ranges from basic data recorded on police crash reports to comprehensive data from special reports by professional crash investigations teams. Data are collected for over 100 crashes designated of interest to the agency for study annually. SCI investigations include information on the pre-crash activities of the persons involved, contributing factors to serious fatal injuries sustained in the crash, environmental roadway factors, and vehicle and equipment factors. The first ground ambulance crash investigations were conducted in 2001 under the sponsorship of NIOSH. We conducted approximately 6 to 10 investigations for them, and since 2009, there have been an average of 4 to 6 ground ambulance investigations per year. On the next slide, we will describe the process of an ambulance crash investigation and what NHTSA does with the information collected from these investigations. I'd like to say that currently the program has morphed into, we have 3 investigations teams across the United States. In the eastern region, the team is located in New York. The central region, a team is located in Indiana. And the third team in the western region in Southern California. Report of ambulance crashes, and the most important thing to us is to be notified of a crash. That begins all the investigation for us. If we're not notified, somehow people think that we just magically are aware of every crash that happens in the United States, and we're not. Typically, we're notified through crashes are reported directly to the Office of EMS. Members of our office find crashes in news articles. Crashes have also been reported to our office by other federal partners, state EMS directors, and by the actual investigators who go out and conduct these investigations. After a crash is reported, our office investigates further into the crash to see if it meets the Office of EMS criteria for inclusion. Investigation criteria include the fatality or severe crash-related injury of any ambulance occupant located in the patient compartment, failure of any equipment inside the patient compartment that may have caused injury sustained by the patient, passengers, or EMS personnel. We look at severe damage or any malfunction of the ambulance vehicle itself that are suspected or it's alleged to have contributed to the crash, such as integrity failure of the patient compartment or a fire. Sometimes unique events occur or there are particular research questions we are interested in. We also investigate these crashes. For example, we are interested in the impact of fatigue in EMS, and if there is a crash that appears fatigue-related, we may investigate for that reason. I'd also like to point out that we're very sensitive to personal identifying information. I know that when we conduct these investigations, people involved are always concerned about their personal information, and we don't collect that type of data. We don't publish it in any of the reports. We're very sensitive to that. And we don't have anything to do with culpability. Often people are also concerned about issues of culpabilities, and our investigations have nothing to do with that. We collect data, we collect the facts, and we state the facts in our reports. In our office, if our office is not able to obtain criteria information from articles of the crash, whether they be news articles, internet news articles, or reports that we receive, an inquiry is made, EMS office makes an inquiry to us and assigns us the case so that we can ask and get these particular information that they need. When the Office of EMS feels that the criteria for inclusion of this crash has been met, they ask us to launch an investigation. We assign the case, the crash, to one of the teams, and they launch and move to investigate the crash. So what constitutes or what's the process of an actual investigation? Once the teams are assigned the crash, the big thing, the big piece of information we try to obtain is a police accident report. So typically our investigations begin by contacting the police department, the police jurisdiction that began the investigation, and obtain a copy of the police report. From there, we try to locate the vehicle either from information gleaned from the police accident report or by calling parties involved. Sometimes the Office of EMS here at NHTSA actually helps us in that by contacting persons that they know, EMS directors, state EMS directors, and they facilitate cooperation or at least help us to locate the vehicles and the persons involved. The investigation process is voluntary. Some agencies may refuse to participate in the investigation, while others may participate but limit the information available to investigators due to pending litigation. This is always an issue with us. The level of cooperation varies, but more often than not, we're able to procure cooperation and inspect the vehicle. Once a vehicle has been located and cooperation has been granted, permission has been granted to inspect the vehicle, the teams fly, drive, do whatever it takes to get on scene where the crash actually occurred. We inspect the scene for evidence of any skid marks, anything that may help us with reconstructing the crash. We inspect any of the vehicles involved if they're available, and again, if we have cooperation to do so. We take pictures of the exterior of the vehicle. We inspect the interior of the vehicle and also take pictures of the vehicle. At some point, whether it's before we launch, the team actually goes to on-site, or it may be afterwards, they try to interview all the persons that are involved if possible. That helps us in, again, reconstructing the crash, gives us an insight into any of the injuries that may have been caused, and it just helps us to reconstruct the crash. Once we get back, or again, even before, we obtain medical information, medical records. If there's been a fatality, we obtain autopsy reports. And all the injuries, we try to establish what the cause of the injury, what the source of the injuries were. And that information is also becomes part of the report that we conduct at the end, or that we publish at the end. So, one thing that I'd like to say is that at the end of our investigations, a formal report is published or is written by the investigator. The report is submitted to the agency for agency review. It always comes to the Office of EMS, and they have their comments, and any questions, comments, issues that come up, we resolve before we publish the report. All the data that we collect, the report that we publish, are published and made available to the public. We have a website, NHTSA.gov. You go to NHTSA.gov, there's a data tab that you can go to, and you'll see the program listed, and you can query for any of the ambulance crashes that we have conducted, and the report is made available. Again, I'd like to stress that, notification is important to us. If you see or if you want to report an ambulance crash, please give either the Office of EMS a call and report the crash. Cooperation is also an issue with us. Again, we're very sensitive to private identifiable information. We don't publish anything like that. We have nothing to do with culpability. The data we collect is to make the vehicle safer and reduce injuries and mitigate the severity of injuries and reduce the crashes. So thank you for the opportunity. Thanks, Noah.
Thank you. Thank you, Harold. And this is just another really great example of where we need your help. So again, you are the folks who are on the ground or at the state level who are hearing about these crashes sooner than we are at the federal level. And like Harold said, most of the reports that we get about crashes that we end up investigating, they come from the news media. And we're just like you. We read gems in the EMS world and find out about crashes through Facebook or Twitter and things like that. But an equally good, if not better, opportunity is to hear directly from the folks who were impacted or who were nearby or who are neighbors of folks who experienced a crash and offer your assistance and your cooperation to us so that we can investigate and that we can learn. These crashes and the investigations that Harold's office does provide such incredibly rich and useful information to us. And you're about to see how useful and why it's so useful. I'm going to ask Miranda to describe our analysis of almost 40 of these crash investigations over the course of 11 years. Remember that the data that you saw at the beginning of the presentation, that descriptive data about 20 years' worth of crashes, that was from every ambulance crash that resulted in a fatality either inside or outside of an ambulance. What you'll see next is a much more in-depth analysis of crashes that resulted in a serious injury or a fatality in the ambulance itself. And that's a very exciting and new analysis that we've completed recently. So take it away, Miranda.
Thank you, Noah. So as Noah said, this analysis is really cool because it allows us to narrow our focus onto some of the injury sources and safety trends that are specific to EMS personnel in an ambulance crash. This analysis used 32 NHTSA ground ambulance crash reports and 6 cases from programs at the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, including 4 cases from the Firefighter Fatality and Prevention Program and 2 cases from the Fatality Assessment and Control Evaluation. These 38 crashes, conducted over a period of 11 years, are able to provide us a more in-depth look on what happens during an ambulance crash. They enable us to differentiate between EMS personnel and the patients and passengers they transport, and they allow us to see the sources of injuries that are sustained during the crash. When we investigated the use of seat belts by EMS personnel, we see that while most ambulance drivers are buckling up, the non-driving EMS personnel are not. More than 3/4 of EMS providers were not wearing a safety belt at the time of the crash, and only 10 of the 50 providers in this analysis were restrained at the time of the crash. When providers were able to be interviewed, many stated they were providing care at the time of the crash, which research agrees is the most often given reason for not wearing a seatbelt. Past studies have shown that providers report that available safety restraints, such as 3-point restraints worn by the provider on the top picture and the lap restraint worn by the provider on the bottom, make it difficult to access the patient and any equipment that they might need to provide patient care. Regardless of the reason for not wearing a restraint, our analysis showed that unrestrained EMS providers were at significantly greater risk of sustaining severe or fatal injuries when they were not wearing a seatbelt. This graph shows the injury severity of EMS providers involved in the crash by their use of seatbelts at the time of the crash. The red bar indicates that no seatbelt was used, and the blue bar indicates that the provider was wearing a seatbelt. As you can see by the glaring amount of red on the page, a much larger number of providers who were not restrained at the time of the crash sustained serious and fatal injuries than those who were wearing a seatbelt at the time of the crash. With the exception of one patient, the rest of the 31 patients in our analysis were wearing safety restraints on the patient cot at the time of the crash. One puzzling factor were the serious injuries and fatalities that we saw sustained by patients, despite their having been secured to the cot at the time of the crash. On closer examination, we noted that the type of restraint system used to secure the patient was associated with the patient remaining on the cot during the crash sequence. Patients can be restrained by 3 lateral restraints across the chest, hips, and legs, or they can be secured with lateral restraints and a shoulder harness, such as the one in the picture above. When not restrained with the shoulder harness, upon initial impact, many patients slide under the lateral restraints and up the backrest of the cot, becoming ejected from the cot and then unsecured during the rest of the crash sequence, exposing them to injuries from contacting the interior cabinets, seats, and walls of the ambulance. This graph demonstrates the association between the type of safety restraint used to restrain the patient to the cot and whether or not the patient was ejected from the cot. The red bar represents those ejected from the cot, while the blue bar represents those not ejected from the cot. As you can see on the left, when safety restraints were not used or only lateral restraints were used, a much larger proportion of patients were ejected from the cot. On the right, where the shoulder harness and lateral restraints were used to secure the patient was much less likely to be ejected from the patient cot. Patients in this study who were ejected from the cot tended to sustain more serious injuries. Many of the severe injuries seen in patients could have easily been prevented if the patient had remained restrained to the cot throughout the crash sequence. The most important finding, in addition to the ones on the slide, is this. By not wearing a seatbelt and not properly restraining patients to the patient cot using both the shoulder harness and lateral restraints, EMS personnel contribute greatly to the severity of injuries that are sustained to themselves and to the patient. Not wearing a seatbelt not only exposes the provider to preventable injuries, it could also contribute to additional injuries of the patient who sustain injuries by contact with unsecured EMS providers. So what can EMS personnel do to be safe and encourage the safety of others while in an ambulance? They can sit down and buckle up. During the course of an EMS career, there will always be instances where providers will need to perform interventions that require them to work unrestrained. Placing an endotracheal tube, initiating an IV, or performing CPR are likely impossible to accomplish while wearing a seatbelt. However, when all of the interventions have been performed and the patient is properly packaged for transport, choose a seat, sit down, and buckle up. Ensure that you can protect your patient by protecting yourself from preventable injuries. In addition, dust off that shoulder harness, reattach it to the cot, and buckle up your patients. No matter what the final destination may be, patients rely on EMS personnel to care for them and deliver them safely. By utilizing the shoulder harness and lateral restraints, you are making them as safe as they can be, and should a crash occur, you are decreasing the chance that they may severely injure themselves or others if ejected from the cot. Keep everyone safe by clicking them into place. For additional information on ambulance crashes or for additional EMS safety resources, you can check out ems.gov safety page at www.ems.gov/safety.htm. And with that, I will turn the slides back over to Noah Smith, who will wrap everything up.
Thank you so much, Marinda. We really appreciate it. And when I was reviewing this data for the first time, I was so struck by the number of patients in the back of ambulances that are being seriously injured or killed, in part because they're not properly restrained, and that feels so preventable and yet so important to good patient care. And so that's an incredibly important lesson for us, and one that you're going to hear us talking about a lot in the future, which is a very positive and strong message. So as we've heard about today, NHTSA has more than 5 programs focused on ambulance safety right now. We collect data, we analyze that information, and we make recommendations to keep patients, providers, and family members safer in the back of ambulances. One group we haven't talked about today yet is on the bottom of the slide on the screen right now, and that's our Office of Behavioral Safety Research. That office is staffed with PhD psychologists and human factors researchers, and they're currently working on a few very interesting topics and studies for us. The first is that they're working to characterize the nation's emergency vehicle operator training program and regulations. And that's in order to study their effectiveness and to recommend improvements over time. And the second thing they're beginning to look at is the impact of fatigue on both drivers of ambulances as well as providers in the back of ambulances. And so you should expect to hear more from us on those two topics in the near future. At our Office of EMS, we act as the coordinator of that program and of that programming, and we help to get the message out through several venues, including the one you're experiencing right now, the EMS Focus webinar. With that, and right on time, I should note, we will begin by taking some questions. So first, I'd like to ask Gabriel if he can just remind folks how to ask questions on the online webinar system.
Certainly. To submit your question, if you're listening over the web, please hit the Ask Question below the slide presentation. Simply type your question into the box and hit the Send button if you would like to send a question.
Thank you very much. And it looks like we have a couple of great questions lined up for us already. The first one is from John, and he asks, to my knowledge, most states do not separate or delineate ambulances from other motor vehicles. But with that, how do you compile your crash statistics? Maybe we'll let Miranda talk about some of our databases that collect information on fatal and injury crashes and how we work with states to make sure that we're getting the most accurate data.
I can. The two databases that we use to compile the information for this report were from the Fatality Analysis Reporting System and the National Automotive Sampling Statistic General Estimate System. Each of these uses police accident reports to collect data, and then they send it to the state, and the state sends it here. For ambulances, they fall under a category we call special vehicle use. Special vehicle use includes fire apparatus, police vehicles, towing vehicles, and ambulances. It is a special box that is checked. According to FARS, an ambulance is defined as any vehicle that has special markings on it that is able to deliver a sick or injured person to another destination. So that is how we tell what an ambulance is and how it is different from another motor vehicle.
Fantastic. Thank you, Miranda. The next question will probably go to Harold and the Office of Special Crash Investigations. And this is about vehicle data recorders. And the question is, are vehicle data recorder data downloaded or used in the ambulance crash investigations?
Yes. We call them event data recorders. That's the generic name we use. If the vehicle is equipped with an EDR and it is supported by the only commercially available or one of the commercially available tools that we have, the Bosch CDR tool, we do image the data recorded and include it in our reports. We have done this in some of the investigations, but very few. Just off the top of my head, I wish I would have looked at that, and I should have anticipated that question when Noah asked. But I know we have imaged a few of them, but very few. And it helps us to reconstruct the crash.
Very good. The next question is about what the ambulance is doing during a crash that we're looking at. And I think we may have two different answers to this question. I'll take the first, and I may ask Miranda to take the second. The question is, what percentage of reported ambulance collisions occurred while transporting a patient? And I think the answer, Miranda will correct me if I'm wrong, I think the answer is when we look at years and years worth of data that's reported to us on fatal crashes and crashes involving injuries, we don't know the answer. We don't know exactly what the ambulance is doing at the time of the crash. But in the in-depth crash investigations, we do have that information, and I'm going to put Miranda on the spot and see if she remembers any of that data for us.
I do. To add on to what Noah said, in FARS, we can't tell who is in the back of an ambulance, so we can't see if it's EMS personnel, a patient, or a passenger. So it isn't possible to determine whether they are transporting a patient or whether there's just 4 people in an ambulance going to get lunch, which is sometimes the case in my volunteer ambulance. However, you might have to do a little math, but I know that in 31 of the reports that we looked at, there was a patient being transported. and that was out of the 38. So we only had 7 crashes that did not involve a patient being transported at the time of the crash.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. The next question is about the fatigue project, and I have a pretty solid answer for this one. The question is, how far into the research for fatigue are you? And the answer is not very far. We have just submitted online through the federal procurement system I think what we call like a sources sought, basically just a teaser out there for contracting companies that may be interested in helping us with fatigue research in emergency medical services. If you're interested in learning more about that project, I encourage you to contact us, or if you want to contact the researcher, we'd be happy to put you in touch with him as well. If folks are familiar with the FedBizOps system, fedbizops.gov, you can search for ambulance or fatigue on there, and you'll be able to find more information. The next question is on where we can find this information. So is ambulance crash data, I'm sorry, that was a repeat question. The next question is back on investigations. I apologize. How many days after a crash can the investigative teams go out to the scene? And should we call if it's a week after the crash or a few days after the crash? Or should we be notifying you hours after the crash?
You're assuming that, we're immediately notified of a crash, which is not necessarily the case. I mean, if we're notified, when we're notified of a crash, we can respond to it within 24 hours. But it just depends on when we are notified of the crash. We can go out, if the vehicle is still available, we can go out 6 months to a year if we can, again, locate the vehicle. But it just depends on notification, and that's why I said earlier, it's real important that when you have these crashes that you notify us immediately so that we can send out a team to investigate if it meets the Office of EMS, their inclusion criteria.
Fantastic. Thank you, Harold. Thank you so much. The next question is, what is the phone number to call to report that a crash occurred? And actually, the easiest thing to do would be to contact the Office of EMS and to report to us directly that a crash may have occurred that may fall under our characteristics that we investigate. And what I just did was put up the ending slide that shows our generic email address and our office phone number. So if your service experienced a crash that you think may fit our characteristics, or if you found out about a crash that you think may be interesting to investigate, please give us a call at that number or shoot us an email, and we'll be sure to get right back to you. We've got just a few questions left here, getting through them. We received 2 questions about the average age of people involved in these crashes, both of the driver during a collision and whether there have been children involved in any of these crashes. Correct me if I'm wrong, Miranda, but we have not looked at average age in the hundreds of crashes over the last few years that we've looked at. Is that right?
That is correct. We have not looked at the average age of drivers. But we have looked at children, and of all of the crashes that we have, and I think there are 172 over the past 20 years, of 172 ambulances that have crashed over the past 20 years, 20 of those cases involved somebody that was under the age of 18.
Very good. The next question is, what constitutes a crash? That's an interesting question, and we might want to talk about the definition that our fatality analysis reporting system uses. That means that these are the crashes that are going to be reported to NHTSA and the ones that are going to show up in our database. Miranda.
So a crash is reported to the fatality analysis reporting system if somebody who is involved in the crash dies within 30 days of the crash. Now, Now, in order for that crash to be reported, it has to occur in a vehicle that was on a traffic way that was available to the public. So it may be possible to miss something that happens in a private driveway. That is the definition for a fatal crash. For crashes that are reported to the National Automotive Sampling Statistic General Estimate System, those can vary depending on the state. A property damage crash would depend on what the state reports. If their limit is 1,000, then they would report all crashes where the property damage is at or more than $1,000, but that's dependent on the state. An injury crash is any crash that involves an injury to a person in the vehicle at the time of the crash.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Our next question is from Matt in Pennsylvania, and Matt says that in Pennsylvania it's mandated that an individual who is driving a ground ambulance needs to have taken an approved EVOC course, as well as apply for an EMS VO credential, which requires driver history questions and additional continuing education credits for all providers. And his question is, are other states doing anything similar? And the beauty of your question is I can't answer it now, but I will be able to answer it in the future. Matt, that is exactly what we're studying through our Office of Behavioral Safety Research. That's nearly exactly the question that we want to be able to answer as well. So what we have begun to do is survey a nationally representative sample of states, obviously the states who have a regulatory role in the EMS system, and in some cases the vehicle itself and the drivers themselves, and also localities who may have different requirements in place for what kind of training and credentials and experience you might need to have in order to operate an ambulance in this case. We're doing that for a few reasons, but the first one is that it was a recommendation from the National EMS Advisory Council. They spent almost a year deliberating and researching on how NHTSA can help to improve the safety of emergency vehicle operations, including ambulances. And their recommendation, their very first recommendation, was to characterize and study the state of emergency vehicle operator training and regulations in the United States. And that's exactly what we're doing. The second and third step of that process is to study the effectiveness of that training and to study whether that training is making a positive difference in the safety of ambulance operations. And finally, to recommend potential improvements to training requirements or anything else that we think might make operating an ambulance safer for us. Very good. Thank you for the questions. We've got time for maybe just one more, and then we'll be able to wrap up. Where do I find the presented ambulance crash statistics, graphs, and charts? Is a great question. And there's part of that question as well is there any data on injuries resulting from ambulance crashes? Because we mostly focused on fatalities from ambulance crashes today. And the answer is yes, and we'll be able to answer both questions together. If you head to www.ems.gov and click on Issues and click on Safety, you'll be able to find more information about our ground ambulance safety portfolio here at NHTSA. You'll be able to download a presentation that was posted last year that goes into greater detail on exactly your question, which is what are the types and severity of injuries associated with ground ambulance crashes. And we did the exact same analysis on injuries as we did with fatalities that we presented about today. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to go into the injuries, so we focused just today on the fatalities. So you'll be able to download that presentation and find out more there. And of course, we're happy to answer any and all questions if you want to reach out to us directly. I should note that for the folks whose questions we did not have time to answer today, we are compiling those, and we have your email addresses, and we will be happy to get back to you. With that, we'll conclude today's installment of EMS Focus. And we'd like to thank all of our presenters and thank those of you who tuned in for participating in today's webinar. Again, the webinar is being recorded and will soon be archived and available on ems.gov for future viewing and listening. For information on future webinars, they're going to take place this summer and throughout the year. And to subscribe to the EMS Focus webinar series, please visit us at ems.gov as well. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great week, and don't forget to buckle up. Thanks, everyone.